And I am really grateful to Geraldine Crawford's vision of holding this annual event and allowing our community to come together and discuss extremely relevant topics in the area of health and well-being. And we are so pleased to have you here with us tonight for this very special event and lecture. Father Paul will be joining us later, and it's an honor to have him. Oh, there he is. He made it. Welcome, Father Paul. Father Paul is the 28th president of the University of San Francisco. He's been our president since 2014, and it's an honor to have him with us today, and he's going to lead the closing remarks following Dr. Hood's lecture and our question and answer period. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions with your registration, and we will also have question cards available for you at the end of Dr. Hood's presentation, so that if you want to submit a question tonight following his presentation, you'll be able to do that. I'm really happy to share that our school is celebrating its 70th anniversary this year, and in the spirit of transforming the development of health across the globe, we are honored to present Dr. Leroy Hood, a truly innovative leader in health. Dr. Leroy Hood is the co-author of The Age of Scientific Wellness, Why the Future of Medicine is Personalized, Predictive, Data-Rich, and in Your Hands. The book advocates scientific wellness via healthcare that is predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory, the 4 Ps. Achieving this requires so much more than our efforts alone. We must partner across all aspects of our healthcare ecosystem to pursue a life-changing path before us. At the USF School of Nursing and Health Professions, we have joined this life-changing path through educating nursing and health professionals for the future. We are committed to educating a workforce dedicated to developing and supporting health for individuals, families, communities, and populations by concentrating on the interaction and interplay between physical, mental, and spiritual health and the environments where people live, work, and play. I would now like to introduce you to Dr. Leroy Hood. Please, let's...
Well, it's a pleasure to be here on this 70th anniversary and to talk about my favorite topic these days, health. So, what I'm going to talk about is a fundamental paradigm change that's going to occur, I would guess, over the next 15 years that will fundamentally transform healthcare. And it's going to be a part of what we call the Human Phenome Initiative. I started a nonprofit, Phenome Health, to push that kind of idea. And it is pushing us then toward something that we call radical health. That is, it's going to be the largest paradigm change ever in the 6,000 years of recorded history of health and so forth. And the fundamental driver for that is data-driven health. But before we get into any of the technical details, let me raise a really fundamental question and point. And that is, if you think of all the human traits that exist, I would argue health is absolutely the most fundamental to all of us, because it's health that underlies and amplifies your development, your education, your ability to carry out a job, to create a community, to be creative and productive. And ultimately, what health is going to do is expand the health span of every single one of us, potentially, and have you move into your 90s or even beyond, mentally alert and physically capable. And of course, the really fundamental question, if we can succeed in doing that, is what are you going to do with the extra 20 years of productive life? Most people don't do a very good job in answering that at all. So what is this whole business, the big idea of thinking very differently about health? Well, it's really quite simple. What we'd like to do in the next 15 years is take a healthcare system that's focused almost entirely on disease at this point in time and have it shift its focus to wellness and prevention. And there are really compelling reasons for doing so. One is, of the top 20 developed countries, the United States is at the bottom in terms of overall quality of health care, in spite of the fact we spend 3 times as much per patient as the next most expensive healthcare system. So there's a real shortcoming there. And the idea is, with data-driven health, that we have the ability to use your own data to assess today where your health is, to be able to extrapolate, if you don't change, where you're going to go in the future, but really importantly, to be able to affect an optimal transition so that your health moves in a maximally productive and healthy kind of trajectory. And that's the how of health. So when I went to Caltech in 1970 as a young assistant professor, and as all do, started thinking about what I wanted to do when I grow up, it was obvious I was really interested in human biology and disease, but it was also equally obvious that it was an enormously complex topic. And at that point, medicine was really limited in what it can do, primarily looking at an individual from the outside, maybe a few tests of one sort or another that you could carry out. But it seemed to me that what one had to do was, one, use the idea of deciphering complexity by generating big data from each individual, and then two, making certain that a lot of that data came from your blood, because your blood is a real window into health and disease, and we'll see exactly why that's so in just a couple of slides. But number three, if you have this enormous amount of data, what are you going to do with it? And that was really the beginning of systems biology. And it was with this glimpse in the early 70s that I set off on the journey that continues up until today, where I looked at a series of, over the years, participated in a series of 7 paradigm changes, and they each fundamentally let us attack this idea of complexity, but in doing so, framed what we want to think about healthcare really is. So the first of these paradigm changes was developing new technologies, bringing engineering to biology. So over the years, we developed 6 instruments, including the automated DNA sequencer. And I had to start a number of different companies and a number of nonprofits to actually get all of those commercialized. Commercialization is a non-trivial and very fascinating and important process. And of course, the essential idea is, as a scientist, since society pays our salaries, it's our obligation to bring to society that's relevant to humankind, and that's what these instruments did. The second paradigm change was the Human Genome Project. I was one of 12 invited to assess whether it was a good or a bad idea, and in the spring of 1985. And we made 2 striking observations. One was it was technically feasible, though at this point in time, really challenging. And the second was we were split 6-6 on whether it was a good idea. Those opposed being fearful that this new first example of big science would swallow up, would swallow up completely. Sorry. If I droop, just say you're drooping. Anyway, and that turned out not to be true at all. And of course, it gave us access to genetic variability, which we're going to use in really interesting ways later on in this lecture. The third paradigm change, I was criticized enormously because my lab became very big to develop all of these instruments. And my argument was, okay, let me start an applied department of biology. And every division at Caltech thought it was a great idea except the biologists, and they vetoed it for obvious kinds of reasons. So it was possible then Bill Gates made a striking donation at the University of Washington, and we started the first cross-disciplinary department. It was enormously successful. And of course, what happened then was really interesting, because what I wanted to do at the University of Washington is create a cross-disciplinary framework and superimpose on that this thing we've come to call systems biology. But the bureaucracy of a big state university made it impossible in 10 or 20 different ways, which is a great discussion in and of itself. But what I resigned from the University of Washington after 8 years and then went to start the Institute of Systems Biology, which really pioneered the whole vision of how we do biology, and it's captured the entire world at this point in time. In the earlier thinking, in the earlier years of 2000, my thinking shifted more from the medicine and just the biology to thinking about healthcare itself. And I argued early in the 2000s that healthcare should be 4P in nature, that is predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory. The first three of those have to do with science, and the last one has to do with almost everything else in the Rubicon of academic projects: psychology, sociology, economics, all the things you need to build a new kind of healthcare system, which is what we'll be talking about in a short period of time. The sixth paradigm change occurred in 2014 when I went to Francis Collins, a good friend of mine, and said, look, I want to start a population, an individual small population, 100 folks, study to do deep data and learn about wellness and prevention. And Francis said, well, the role of NIH is only to study disease. We'll never fund anything in wellness and prevention. And of course, that has changed really quite strikingly. But it's surprising how strongly held it was at that point in time. So philanthropy made it possible to do that. And from that, we created a company called Aerofail that I'll talk in more detail about, that was very successful over a 4-year period in bringing this data-driven health to the organization. And then finally, in 2016, Rod Hochman asked me to become Chief Science Officer at Providence, 52 hospital healthcare system in 7 states. And I thought this is a great way to be able to take data-driven science and health into the system itself. And he asked me to do 2 things: 1, to bring genomics, and 2, to bring scientific wellness, which is what we call data-driven health. And I would say on the first, I succeeded pretty well. On the second, I failed totally for a lot of really interesting reasons. But in 2013, I decided if I was ever to achieve this idea of wellness and prevention before I died, I better start something new and begin in a new trajectory. And in 2021, we started Phenome Health. And that led to this idea of the Human Phenome Initiative. And it is going to be the catalyst, as I'll show you, for making this big revolutionary change that we talked about before. I learned many things from these paradigm changes, I will say. But the most fundamental is every new idea needs a new organizational structure. Almost never can really original ideas emerge from bureaucracies that were honed by the past, just barely capable of dealing with the present. Now, that's a negative point of view, and it isn't true for smaller institutions in some cases, but it is of every big institution I know of, including large federal agencies and everything. So anyway, where do we stand right now? So we started 5 nonprofits and 4 for-profit companies to affect these paradigm changes, and others were started too. NIH started the National Institute of Genome Research, which was absolutely necessary for the Human Genome Project. So the genome, as you know, is the source code for your development. And what it makes possible is a whole series of different health trajectories that are alternative fates for you. And what determines which of these alternative fates that you take is, or the different phenotypes as you go from a fetus to a normal development, old age, and so forth. How does your phenotype change? What modulates it? And that's what the measurements we call the phenome. And the phenome, there are 2 really fundamental major determinants of what you become. One is your own behavior. You really have an enormous say in how healthy you're going to be. And the second is your environment. The environment in which you can live can impact you absolutely enormously. And so by measuring your behavior and your environment and their combination with the genome, we can do things like looking at the blood, analytes, like looking at the gut microbiome and digital health measurements and things like that. And we'll talk about those in some enormous detail. But the final point I want to make is the long-term focus of phenome health is to catalyze this big radical revolution. And to do that, we have to have a second genome-like project, which we call the Human Phenome Initiative, 1 million people being studied in these phenome analyses over a 10-year period of time. It's the equivalent of 3 B-2 bombers. And the question you can ask your congressman and president is, would you rather bomb different countries more effectively, or would you rather transform your health? And if you ask it that way, it's hard to say I'd rather bomb. But anyway, so this thing called systems biology, the really important point there is the blood is this window into health and disease. And it is so because it bathes all your organs, and every organ secretes molecules into the blood. And if you can quantify them, you can validate how they're changing over in time, and that serves as a report for what the cognate organ from which they come is doing. And we've analyzed such molecules called organ-specific molecules now for 25 different organs, and it works utterly beautifully. And of course, that generates an enormous amount of digital data. And one of the essential features of systems biology is to transmit this data into the biological networks that underlie normal and disease physiology. And the dynamics of these networks give us deep insights into the mechanisms that are actually carried out. And one of the big things we'll talk about briefly at the end of the lecture is we can use the tools of AI, which are knowledge graphs, which are digital twins, which are large language models and things like that, to take the very complicated genome-phenome data of each individual and will be able to prioritize their actionable possibilities in accordance with most important to least important, and truly have a personalized medicine. We're working on systems to do this, and it's probably going to take 5 to 10 years to get a really effective series of algorithms and tools to do this. But it's going to have an absolutely spectacular result in medicine. And here's a place that nurses may even think about playing a role in the future. The real key for that to work is that the physician or the caregiver and AI be partners, that they work together, that they feel comfortable. And if they can do that, what the AI can do for each general practitioner is make them a domain expert in every single aspect of medicine. Imagine the kind of treatment you can give your patients if you have at your fingertips the ability to do this. So the AI will give you the details, and the physician has to use the judgment and insights and intuitions that humans are so famous for. And then finally, here are some of the features of systems biology, which we won't go into and talk about, but they are the essence of how you understand complexity. And a course on systems biology should be in every fundamental educational program for, I would argue, physicians and or nurses, and we'll return to that point at a later point in time. So the vision then is each of us has this health trajectory, and we can use data-driven health to follow your trajectory and to optimize it. And a really important point about the trajectory is there are 3 different phases of health. One is wellness, a second is disease, and the third is the transition between the two. And I'm talking about the earliest transitions between the two. And the reason the early transition between the two is really important is on several model systems and on recently a human, as I'll show you later, we were able to show that from the point of initiation of a disease, there was an exponential increase as the disease progressed in the number of disease-perturbed networks. And by the time you got to clinical diagnosis, the networks were horribly complicated, such that all drug companies could do in making drugs were to treat symptoms and not causes. And that's why cancer is a classic example of expensive drugs that really treat very well symptoms, but rarely do they ever give a cure. And there are some cancers that are exceptions to this, obviously. But again, I want to emphasize, for wellness, we have the ability to optimize it, your wellness. I would say the average person has reached, at best, 20 or 30% of their wellness. And that's because there are intrinsic deficiencies in your genome and your phenome that we can correct. And data-driven health can correct those things. So that goes beyond traditional health. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. The second point is I'm going to show you that we have one very powerful way of identifying in the blood transition points years before the disease ever manifests. And it gives us plenty of time for preventive measures and or therapies that can reverse the disease when it's very simple. And of course, we can do traditional disease in kind of classic ways and so forth. So the really key points then are that one, this is going to lead to this paradigm change where we have wellness and prevention. And you can begin to see now how to optimize wellness and how to discover early transitions leads to the idea maybe in 15 years we can do away with more than half the chronic diseases that we're faced with today. And that will turn out to be an enormous cost savings, as we'll see a little later in this point in time. So, there is the company called Airville that lasted for 4 years, 5,000 clients, data-driven health and everything. And those data have been mined continuously from when the company ended in 2019 until today. And we have 25, 30 papers that give you vignettes of what wellness and what disease prevention are all about. And I'm going to go and show you 4 or 5 of these very simple vignettes to give you an idea of what it's about. But Airvale also really stressed how important the gut microbiome is. And I want to say we didn't do it in Airvale, but the third fundamental element is brain health. And that's something we're going to be doing in spades in the future. And we'll talk about that in just a few moments and so forth. So here are the assays we used: whole genome sequencing, blood analytes. We looked at proteins and metabolites and clinical chemistries and things. The gut microbiome assessed the number of different species in that film that posits itself between the food and external things you take into your GI tract and getting in the blood. And it profoundly influences the effect of drugs, of food, and it makes suggestions about how you can optimize even the aging process. We can talk possibly about that. And then we used Fitbit and digital information. And what the analysis of this data led to are more than 200 actionable possibilities, which, if taken up by the appropriate individual, could improve wellness and or let you avoid disease. And we used human coaches that could handle up to 1,000 different patients to bring these actionable possibilities and explain them. And they acted very much like your mother, suggesting this is really something you should, or your father, whoever. Anyway, and that company, I think, was one of the most important companies I ever started, even though it was not financially successful for reasons that are obvious in retrospect now. Here are examples of 25 papers that we've talked about. So let me run through and give you 5 examples, 5 little stories that came out of these data. And the first has to do with what scientific wellness is and how we came to actionable possibilities. And of course, this was in a 108-person project where we looked at the 6 different types of data that were listed there, and we could do statistical correlations. And they added up to be about 3,500 correlations of a data bit in one type with data bits in the other 5 types of data. And those correlations led to interesting relationships that took us to the literature. And in all cases, we validated the 200 actionable possibilities as having medical rationale and so forth. And one thing I will say is that in the million-person project, we estimate that there'll be 10 to 30 or 40,000 actionable possibilities. So you can begin to understand that's a complexity that couldn't be dealt with by people alone. You will really need the AI to process and prioritize the information that you have. Now, this second study is the one that's really key for preventive chronic diseases. And it all came about through a study. We made an observation in Airvale that of the 5,000 people, 167 transitioned to chronic diseases. And the first person that transitioned was a patient called Eve. And what we did with, and she transitioned to stage 4 pancreatic cancer, which is a grim diagnosis. we looked at blood draws 6 months apart prior to the time of her diagnosis, and as far out as a year and a half or so, we were able to see 5 proteins that were greatly elevated, 3 of which mapped into classic disease-perturbed networks for stage 4 pancreatic cancer. So that made us believe we identified a very early diagnostic marker, and in this case, you had a lot of time to look at it. We went on then to demonstrate. There were 35 people that transitioned to cancer. We looked at 10 of them, and in all cases, we found exactly what we found with Eve, only different proteins for different cancer transitions and so forth. And our estimates in the million-person project is we'd see 200,000 such transitions. So it means we statistically would nail the early markers for virtually every chronic disease that you run into, except maybe extremely rare ones and so forth. And these things are the key to prevention, because our annual budget for healthcare is $4.4 trillion. 86% of these dollars are spent on chronic diseases, and the vast, vast majority are spent on 4 chronic diseases. So diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, and cardiovascular disease. So we're starting a major study on diabetes from a data-rich point of view that let us see things you could never see about diabetes before, and I'll describe that very briefly when we actually come to it and everything. Now, we actually did an analysis of Eve to look at the biological networks that became perturbed with each of the 4 blood draws before she got the diagnosed cancer. And here you can see the disease-perturbed networks in red being indicated and becoming increasingly complex. And you can see, even by the 4th example, there's no one drug that's going to cure that disease. That would cause 10 or 100 drugs. And the point is, for most chronic diseases, you aren't going to cure them with drugs. You're going to cure them with early prevention, okay? That really important take-home thing. Biological aging, we had the ability, interestingly enough, to develop an algorithm for one's biological age, the age your body says you are, because we had people that varied from 21 to 93, and we could bin them in 10-year categories. And what you could see as you looked at these 10-year categories is the control of analyte expression in the blood was lost increasingly. But what was really interesting is, in some cases, you'd have 70-year-olds that looked like they were 30 years old. And that operationally is a person who's aged very well. And from that, we developed an algorithm. Oh, okay, that's probably a great idea, as long as I stay where I am. Okay, thank you. Okay, can you hear it? Okay, yeah. Anyway, so what is really key about biological age is, one, we were able to demonstrate for women in Airvale, for every year you stayed in the program, you lost 1.5 years biological age, 6 years over the 4 years. And for men, it was about 0.8 years or so. So it clearly is a metric for aging. And the really interesting question is, how much can we push your biological age below your chronologic age? The further we do, the more effectively you're aging, okay? Second point that was really interesting is we could actually assess the aging of your organs with this approach too. So your kidney, your liver, your immune system, things like that. And the algorithm actually gave us ideas about how you can optimize or minimize the aging process, if you will, and move inappropriate numbers into appropriate conjunction and everything. There are two major classes. You can use analytes to do biological age, or you can use something called epigenetics, which just modifies genomes and the genes they can express. It's only the analytes that tell you how you can further optimize things. The epigenetics gives you your biological age, but it doesn't tell you how you can improve it in any way, shape, or form. So we also demonstrated that diseases always increased your biological age. And we had one, in fact, very, very severe COVID patient where we measured him to be 20 years above his chronologic age. And unfortunately, what would have really been interesting is to ask when he reversed, but he died, so we didn't have the chance to do that kind of experiment. But anyway, this is a metric for wellness. A metabolic BMI, as you know, there's a classic BMI measured by height and weight, and that lets you look at chronic diseases and things like that. But it's inaccurate, it's very slow to respond to changes in your metabolism. It inaccurately predicts for 30% of the people their metabolic state. So we actually determined a biologic BMI using metabolites in blood that was flexible and accurate and did really interesting things. For example, 10% of the people that were okay with the classic thing actually have serious metabolic problems that people didn't know about. For example, we could take obese people and stratify them into really interesting categories that correlate with new fat drugs and how effective they are and things like that and so forth. So it's a metric that responds to changes in your diet, in your exercise very, very quickly. And it'll be a standard, I think, for the future. And of course, brain health is really a key point. And in this regard, we're collaborating with a company called Posit and Michael Merzenish. And he has digital ways, 40 or so measurements that can assess 25 different cognitive features in the individual. And what is really important to realize is the brain is really plastic. And the important observation Merzenish got the Kevley Prize for was demonstrating that for a normal individual, your cognitive abilities rise to a maximum in your mid-30s. And for almost everybody, because you don't know how to exercise your brain properly, they decay after that. He went on and took 1,000 80-year-olds and showed that the majority of them could be reconstituted back in their cognitive features to what they might have been in their mid-30s if they're willing to put in the work to do the exercises and things like that. And he also went on to show that these cognitive measurements give you an assessment of depression, of schizophrenia, of classic susceptibility to drug addiction and things like that that are going to be very useful in the future in a preventive sort of sense. So anyway, it's going to be a major part of the program when we go on in the future, things that we've talked about here. So there are two major kinds of wellness: traditional wellness and data-driven wellness. And the actionable possibilities come from the genome. There are 7 different categories of variants in the genome that collectively add up to 10,000 plus actionable possibilities that are already in the human population. And for the phenome, there are large numbers of possibilities that are there. And of course, if you integrate genome and phenome together, you get still other possibilities there. And what this means is that we can use data-driven wellness to actually optimize individually how you deal with exercise, how you deal with diet, how you deal with sleep and things like this. But it's much more than that. If this is the boundary condition of things you can improve by just traditional medicine, what happens when we put in a data-driven approach to medicine? Well, for the genome, you'll see new actionable possibilities arise, and the microbiome, and the metabolome, and the proteome, and wearable data. Now, that'll be for the entire population, so if you want to look at what it looks like for a single individual, it'll be a small fraction of those things that actually get prioritized into what's there. And again, AI is going to play this filtering role that we talked about here, I think, in a very interesting way. So let's talk about where we are today in the Human Phenome Initiative and what we plan to do. And we're going to use 10 times as much data as we did in the Aerofail program. We're going to be able to look in detail at the immune response in all chronic diseases and in wellness in a way we've never looked at it before because we can use single-cell analysis of white blood cells. And I won't go on. We've done that for COVID, and the results were absolutely spectacular. Number two, brain health is absolutely critical. If our health span is going to take us into our 90s, we need our brain as well as our body and our gut microbiome and so forth. And of course, a third thing that is really going to be true is there are going to be some fascinating new digital health devices that will let us make measurements of really interesting things. And I'll tell you, one that has not been done well to date, but is going to be very important, is heart rate variability. And I won't go into it, except to say it integrates the response of your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems and gives you very deep insights into what your moods are and how susceptible you are to high blood pressure and all these other kinds of things that you can actually run into. Electronic health records are going to be very important, so it's going to be exhaustive. We've put together a platform where we need to be able to educate and recruit patients, where we need to be able to collect the samples, the bloods and the urines and so forth. And then we need to be able to send those samples out to the people that are going to generate the data, generally commercial vendors. We've built a computational platform for doing complicated analyses that we've talked about of the type here. And of course, that gives you actionable possibilities, spin-off companies, new insights in medicine, all the other kinds of things. But what's really been key is to create a series of partners, the Buck Institute and their common interest in aging. Guardian Research Network is our clinical partner. They have access to 50 million patient records. They have good electronic health records. The patients are already consented for something like the Million Person Project. And they lie in 13 states in the South and Southeast across large African American and Latino populations. And diversity in data is absolutely central to everything we do. Posit, I've talked about for brain health. Google, we're working on their large language model together with them, putting it together with knowledge graphs and digital twins and so forth. Our board has Jeff Wilkie, who's number 2 at Amazon in all its formational years. Roger Perlmutter, who is number 2, both at Amgen for a long time, and then for a long time at Merck. And then Maria Clava, who was 17 years president at Harvey Mudd, arguably the best undergraduate school in the country. And she transformed it from having about 13% women to having 60% women when she left at the end of 17 years, which I think is absolutely remarkable kind of accomplishment. And then scientific advisors, George Church, most people have heard of. Ralph Snyderman, arguably the father of clinical medicine. Esther Dyson is just an absolutely marvelous investor individual who loves wellness, and computer-type people. So we really have good people initiating many different ideas for us. So on the phenome, we're really doing a series of short-term projects now. One, we want to start in a large healthcare system, a program just exactly like Caravale, but it'll be in the context of doctors, and it'll be in the context of the AI things that we talked about here. Number two, I said we're going to use a big data approach to chronic diseases, starting with diabetes, and that will give us the ability to look at diabetes with a resolution that's never before been impossible. And we're going to do next Alzheimer's, and we're already in the design phase of that as well. We're looking at several biobanks that have interesting diabetes cohorts that go over 15 or 20 years, and that will allow us to capture, because they have blood samples all the way across the entire life history with the clinical data that have already been collected of diabetes. And then finally, we're going to use the data-rich approach for looking at physiology. And it's really interesting. There are data deserts in your genome, and an enormous number of them have to do with women, interestingly enough. So we've started a major program in pregnancy now. We've brought 130 women through 5 different blood samples across pregnancy and correlated those with the health of the fetus and the mother, and we plan to do it for another 200 individuals. And at the end of this study, I think we'll know more by far than we ever have known about pregnancy. But I'd like to take the infants from that and do child development for the next 12 to 15 years. And of course, a really key area that is totally void of any detailed information is menopause, and I think that's a really important other area to do. We've been asked to submit an ARPA-H proposal on phenomics, and have done that, and it'll get us started in a beautiful way if we actually can do it. And then the long-term project, of course, is the million-person project. So, as I said before, we want to take the data from individuals and put it into knowledge graphs which connect the data of the individual with all the information that exists in PubMed to a first approximation, or into a digital twin which has the ability to forecast and speculate about future health trajectories. I'd be glad to talk about those in as much detail as you want. But both of those prepare these data in very good ways then for putting them in large language models, and for each individual giving us this list of prioritized possibilities to avoid the limitations of the genome where we can, and to avoid the limitations of the phenome. And that's exactly what data-driven health is actually going to do for us. On the education side, we've talked about P4. And again, I said the first 3 Ps are science. And the 4th P, of course, is psychology and sociology and education and all the other kinds of things. And the essential 4th P is, how do we persuade patients, physicians, nurses, healthcare leaders, healthcare technology leaders, pharma, regulators, politicians, etc., on and on and on. How are we going to take them away from their utter addiction to making money with disease, rather than making money by making people healthy and letting them avoid chronic disease? If you state it that way, it makes a lot of people angry. I can tell you that. So we've done a lot of things. We've written a textbook on systems biology and medicine that'll be out in a year. And we've used the relevant chapters in that textbook to create a 4-module year-long course for juniors in high schools and students that are about P4 medicine, P4 healthcare and systems medicine. And I'd argue the kids, when they graduate from this, will know more than 95% of the doctors about the future of healthcare. But more than that, they will really have thought about the 4th P and realize they're the master of their own healthcare and what they have to do about it. We've actually just written a paper for Nature Genetics Reviews that talks about phenomics and how it's going to, its relationship to genomics and everything. And then we've persuaded Scientific American to publish one set of about 8 papers on the new science of wellness, and we're doing a similar thing for health span and healthy aging. And these are enormously useful for students and for teachers and frankly for physicians as well. And we found in the first set, they were very, very effective. And then finally, we're doing a film, and maybe doing 2 films, we'll see, on, I'd like to say the last 5,000 years of wellness that's culminated by the biggest paradigm change ever, data-driven wellness, and coming to understand what it is and what the opportunities are for the individual, as well as the responsibilities for the individual and so forth. We did write a book that summarized virtually all of the things I've talked about here. And again, the genetics article I'd already mentioned. Let me just say, I think there are potential new roles that nurses can play, and it can be actually engaged actively in the data analysis process. And I really encourage one to think big if you start thinking about these kind of problems, but also in delivering data-driven insights to patients, the health navigators and so forth, I think are key. These big observational clinical trials, big and little, there are going to be many, many of them, and I see nursing playing really key roles in being able to effectively manage and collect the knowledge that's going to be necessary for doing those things, and then getting involved in the education process itself. And I just listed 5 different possible courses that one might consider if you started thinking about things, and you couldn't do them all at once, and you'd have to do them, I would guess, one at a time and adjust your curriculum. I mean, I remember talking with 4 medical schools about changing their curriculum and getting enormously negative responses. And one of them said, well, maybe we'll put just a little systems biology in this course. I said, if you put a little in, you'll never get anywhere. You'll be wasting everybody's time. Either you have to take a step forward and do something significant, or you just adhere to the old-fashioned ways of doing things and let someone else get ahead of you. But anyway, but I think nursing really has a wonderful chance to be a leader in a very new, radical, different kind of healthcare that serves the individual and not the financial benefits of the system. And that's, I think, the real criticism I'd level at the system today. There are 5 challenges: quality, aging population, chronic disease explosion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and increasing costs. And I just want to argue that if you think about it, the million-person project is exactly the project we need to be able to answer all of those kind of questions and validate the idea, 1, that it will increase individual wellness, 2, there'll be striking savings coming from eliminating the chronic disease aspects of it, And then 3, the whole idea of technologies that will emerge that are eventually going to bring wellness to the home and mediated through cell phones. And that is an enormously liberating kind of thing. And we can actually ask what the benefits are. And the one we've already talked about, substituting wellness and prevention for disease orientation. But if we bring wellness to the home with the cell phone and everything, we can actually democratize healthcare for the entire world. For the first time, we could think about taking healthcare to Africa or other underdeveloped nations and beginning in an incremental way to start building and transforming that kind of healthcare. And I think that's very possible. The other big revolution that's coming, of course, is the AI physician-nurse partnership that's going to make it possible to treat people beyond the dreams of anything a physician has ever had before. We have a terrific team, very small, that has mediated this for the last 3 or 4 years. These are the major players, and we have just about the same number of consultants who are doing really interesting kinds of things. And with that, I hope I've given you enough to think about for the future.
Can you hear me? Oh, how about now? All right. Well, such a fascinating and forward-thinking and amazing talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Hood. Many of the questions that I sort of had pre-planned, you answered so eloquently during the talk. So I want to open it up right now to our audience, and I will come, if you just want to raise your hand if you have a question for Dr. Hood, and I can go ahead and bring the mic to you.
Ron Najati, I'm a chemistry grad here and also founder of several biotech companies. In your 4 Ps, what if you find out that ultra-processed food is a big player in metabolic disease that we're encountering around the world, everywhere?
I think we should get rid of it. And I don't say, what if? I say it is. I think ultra-processed foods are a disaster. I mean, you know, it gets to the point of how many battles can you fight at once? But that is a major battle, and I think that's one that should be taken on. And I really plan to do it in the educational parts of the materials we have here. And there'll be utterly compelling arguments that I think, if you can at least begin by having people realize we don't want to eat these things. I mean, to give you an example, I visited India recently, and they've had a real epidemic of diabetes there, and especially diabetes in the young. And it correlated with an enormous infestation over the past 10 years or so of Colonel Sanders' fast chicken. And so these kids only ate fried chicken most of the time, and I mean, it was a foregone conclusion what was going to happen. So I think that's really important. That's the environment, in a sense. And we have to make changes in the environment just as we make changes in our personal adjustment to life. But I think if you want that 20 years of creative and productive life, you really have to take some responsibilities, because you're going to have to iron out some of your genome and phenome difficulties that won't come from just classic healthcare and doing push-ups and eating good food and everything. There are things you need to do to repair deficiencies that come from the human genome and all phenome.
Hi, my name is Lizzie Callum with the ESN as well as clinical faculty here. You talked a lot about development of disease process, things that we see such as cancer or Alzheimer's, diabetes. How do you see this playing out for genetic conditions as well as things such as autoimmune or even undiagnosed conditions, things that people struggle with for 10, 20 years sometimes with difficulty getting diagnoses.
Well, I think there are many, many genetic conditions that we know about already. There are 7,000 Mendelian recessives. There are roughly a similar number of rare diseases, single dominant gene diseases and all. Those are things that I think we can begin to think about how to dealing with rationally. And to give you an example, in Mendelian recessives, we looked in Airvale at people with hemochromatosis, okay? And what we were able to demonstrate strikingly is we had 9 homozygous individuals that should have had very high levels of transferrin of iron in the blood and all. Only 3 did. So they're activating suppressor genes in individuals that can actually make a dominant not a dominant. And conversely, we were able to show that there were about 25 heterozygotes, and 9 of these had blazingly high levels of iron. So there are genes that can activate a single defective copy and make it equivalent. So those are all things, if you're susceptible to a Mendelian trait, the doctor should know about it and be able to follow the blood analytes that reflect the onset of the deficiencies that are going to lead to disease and things like that. And that's another preventive measure that's going to be very, very powerful in the future. That's a great question.
Apologize in advance for the naivete question, but a million people seems like a large number, but I'm wondering, is it large enough if you want to really look at full diversity of demographic, whether it be ethnicities or sex or other elements that you're going to have to track and predict across?
So I think the answer is that it will be sufficient to do many of the things that we want to validate. We want to validate the actionable possibilities and expand them out. We want to be able to look at the markers that will give us insights into transition to chronic disease. We actually want to look at polygenic scores and what they do for your genetic risk, and to be able to follow the high-risk people to show they're okay until the analytes start to move up into a dangerous kind of level and things like that. So for all of those things, we can calculate, do power calculations, and show that'll work. Will it give us the entire diversity of the human population? No, it won't do that. I mean, there are a lot of things that it won't be able to do, but I'm arguing there'll be enough of the kinds of things I showed you here today where we have a nice proof of principle, but they'll be validated unequivocally by 1 million people. And that will be the triggering catalysis for the switch. And it'll be gradual. It isn't going to come all at once. And in fact, one of the really interesting questions is the cost savings that come from eliminating chronic diseases are mostly going to go to payers in the beginning, okay? And, payers, I have to say, are the middlemen that really make the cost of healthcare in the U.S. astronomical compared to most other places, because everybody else has a single payer kind of system. But what we're doing that I think would, and I've gone to payers and said, look, we have some of these preventive things coming, and their attitude seems to be, we're really making a lot of money. Unless you can show that I can make a profit in the next quarter, I'm not interested in anything you have to say. But there are rare healthcare systems that have integrated the payer-provider function, and we're dealing with one such. And that means if the benefits go to the payer, the provider also gets, it's an integrated kind of sharing of things. And the payer is very excited about these, the one person that heads the payer side, as well as the CEO. And what I'd love to see are a number of integrated healthcare systems like this do wildly well in saving money and make the other healthcare systems realize they're not ever going to compete on a disease basis with somebody who's doing wellness and prevention. So those are the kind of things that we're going to be playing with.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hood. I'd like to invite Father Paul up. I know that so many of you have so many more questions for Dr. Hood, but we do want to keep aware of the time. So I'm going to invite Father Paul to, and Dr. Hood, please, we would like you to stay right there.
I'll stay right here.
Thank you, Dr. Hood, for a really informative, challenging, and inviting foray into this next generation of scientific care for human persons. I can't help but think that the alumni of our School of Nursing and Health Professions, that so many other USF alums are ready to take up this challenge and apply these insights into clinical settings and in more popular settings for the holistic care of people. I got to say that we got you beat by about 450 years because Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits and started the largest educational system in the world, 165 universities and 500 high schools, all over. The foundation of the way we educate our nurses, first semester, last semester for the BSN, is nursing in the Jesuit tradition. And we start with this notion of cura personalis, care for the person. So this idea that your team is developing so wonderfully is excellent. Thinking of the human being as a whole being. Certainly we are an amazing set of biological miracles that this thing actually works. But also our psychological health, our mental health, our emotional health, our spiritual health. And you've shown us so well that it's the whole person who needs to be cared for and cared about. And I can't help but think too that, our data science students, bachelor's and masters, our public health students, bachelor's and masters, as well as our bachelor's, masters, and doctoral students in nursing, I think that we're ready. Good to see Dr. Brilliant, a good friend of the university. I think we're ready to apply out into the world the insights that you shared with us this evening. And while I have you all here, the School of Nursing and Health Professions has for many years lived in Cowell Hall. We're getting ready to make a move to the former Blood Center's Irwin Memorial Blood Bank. Is going to be the new home of our Nursing and Health Professions School. We're going to team them up with biology. We're going to bring in some physiology and kinesiology, mental health. So we're going to be able to build out a health sciences campus, which I think is going to enact the kind of education. But we won't be too far from psychology, and we won't be too far from theology. And so, I'm just excited about the possibilities. And I think the fundamental challenge you've given us today is the challenge that we all want to embrace. How do we take the profit incentive and keep it, there as a part of it, but really have human thriving as the goal. So, for example, we're a carbon neutral campus. You go into the dining commons and order a flatbread and they'll say, would you like plant-based protein or animal-based protein? Our students begin already, all of our students begin not only to have a lighter footprint, a lighter carbon footprint, but a much healthier care for themselves as a whole person. Alongside cura personalis is cura apostolica, care for the whole person, care for the whole project. So systems thinking is not only about this system, but it's about these larger systems that can be humanized and can be made then to care for everyone, including the least served And you mentioned Africa. There are amazing health practitioners in Africa. Amazing. They just need access to technology, access to exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for gracing us. We have a little memento for you. And so Dr. Leroy Hood, esteemed guest lecturer, Radical Health, how the Human Genome Initiative will transform human healthcare.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Hood. This has just been a fascinating presentation. We are so grateful for your presence and your willingness to share your experience and your life's work with us. And we plan to join you in that, in changing the paradigm and shifting us to wellness, a focus on wellness. I would like to invite all of our guests to move from this room over to the other side to enjoy a lovely reception. We are so thankful that you joined us tonight. A healthy reception. And really do, one of the best things about health, leading towards health is community. So please enjoy the sense of community here at the University of San Francisco School of Nursing and Health Professions. And please stay tuned. Keep watching your emails for more news about some of our 70th anniversary celebrations later as the year progresses. Thank you again.